Now, I've posted several videos about making a character and different ways to decide on that character's attributes. And I promised that in this video I would show you how you can start to use those attributes to determine what happens in a given story. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So let's start by choosing a race. In this case, we'll choose elf. And I won't adjust these attributes. I'll just go with the starting one. But if we continue, so if you've seen past videos, you might be familiar with this setup where it says you must cross the river, and you have the option to wade across the river or cross over the bridge. And we know that previously, if you waded across the river, you would be fine unless you were a dwarf, in which case you'd be swept away. Or if you crossed over the bridge, different things would happen for different races. The elf, well, there'd be a monster on the bridge, and the elf would be thrown off the bridge to their death. The dwarf would smite the monster with their axe and cross the bridge, and the human would be asked a riddle. So let's see what I've changed that to. Let's start with wading across the river. And we see that we get this new sort of message which says rolling against size. That's what SIZ is. Rolled 8, success. You wade across the river, you win. So let's go through a couple of different runs of this because it's obviously very short. I'll be an elf again. Wade across the river. In this time, rolling against size, we've got a 14, and that is a failure. You might notice, if you're familiar with the way that role-playing games work, you can see that the size is 8, and it looks like if you roll a 1 to 8, then that's a success, and if you roll over the attribute that's been rolled against, then that's a failure. So in this case, you're too short to keep your head above water, and you soon drown, you lose. So let's try the other option. Let's be a dwarf this time. And let's cross over the bridge instead. In this case, there's a fierce monster guarding the bridge, and we roll against strength and get a success. We roll against strength and get another success. And the beast cowers from you and allows you to cross, and you win. Let's do one more. I'll be a human this time. And I'll just take the attributes as they are at the beginning. And let's cross over the bridge. And this time we fail both of our rolls against strength. We've got a 20 and a 13, and we have a strength of 10. And the beast picks you up and hurls you from the bridge. You lose. So we've seen what happens when you fail twice. We've seen what happens when you succeed twice. If you were to succeed once and fail twice, the beast would ask you a riddle, and then whether you got across would depend on whether you could answer the riddle. So let's have a look at how I coded that. So we'll X out of that and have a look at the code here. We'll go over to the relevant section, which is this one. And again, this setup is fairly similar to it's sort of a combination of two. If you saw the last video, you would recognize that one, that one, that one, that one, and then this one was empty and blank. And then we've added on this structure, which is similar to one we had before, where this page that I've highlighted gives you the choice, and that sends you to either wade or bridge. And this time, bridge has a screen, or a page, sorry, which deals with if you're asked a riddle. And you might also notice that there's this new page that's rolling versus attribute. So let's start with wade. Okay, and as always, I'll zoom in so it's a bit easier. Okay, so what we've got here is we set Z to 6. Z is one of the sort of temporary variables. It's used for different things throughout the game. So we set Z to 6, and then we have a new type of command which is include, and it's got the usual lesser than and greater than signs on either side, and then we've got include, double square brackets, and then some text, end square brackets, and you know that that's the same format. If you've been following along with these videos, you know that that's the same format that we use to link to pages, and indeed this is the name of a page, role versus attribute. Now, include is similar to goto, which I've covered in a previous video. Goto sends the program to a new page. Include is sort of go to, but also come back. So what it does is it sends the program to a new page, in this case, role versus attribute. But because it's an include rather than a go to, the program knows that if it gets to the end of the page without any other options, that it should return to where it left. So it'll come to this bit and then it'll execute this other code here. If we'd put a go to here, if this had been a go to instead, any code after the go to would be completely useless because it would just go to that page and then continue on from there. But include is sort of go to, but also come back when you run out of stuff to do. So let's go to role versus attribute to see what happens. And the reason that you would do this, by the way, if you're wondering, well, why would you include this page? Why wouldn't you just have the code? Why not just put the code there? Well, the answer is it's useful if you're going to have code that's going to be executed more than once and can be exactly the same. So instead of putting the code in each page where it is executed, you put it in one page and then put an include in all of the other areas, and that will save you some space and it'll save you retyping. And also, if you decide to change how this works, you only have to change it in one place instead of however many there are in the program. At the moment, there's only 2, but this sort of operation is one that is likely to be used lots of times. So it's best to sort of set it up like that from the beginning. So let's look at role versus attribute and see what it does. So we know that it sets Z to 6 and that we're going to role versus attribute with Z having a value of 6. So if we scroll down to role versus attribute, okay, so there's a bit of new code here as well. Span, this is another HTML command. That is, it's a command from the HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's the standard language for websites. Although there are others, quite a lot of others in use. HTML is sort of the basic one. Span is quite similar to div, which I've covered already. You have span and then you have to have /span. The difference is that span doesn't leave a blank line. I've been a little bit, this is probably a bit sloppy to have both div and span in the same program, but you know, I've done what I've done. Basically, it sets up a paragraph, much as div does. So if you've seen previous videos, you will have seen me do this command. Center. You can do things like that with span. In fact, the format is exactly the same, except that you put span instead of div, and you put /span at the end instead of /div. And in this case, we've got a new command here. Style equals quote color red, and what that's doing is it's telling the program that the text that's printed within this paragraph is to be printed in red. So we start this paragraph. We set y to a random value between 1 and 20. So this is sort of the equivalent of, if you've ever played tabletop role-playing games, you know that sometimes you roll a d20. Well, setting a value to random 1 to 20 is sort of the same as that. Then you say set x equals rolling against ATZ. Now we remember that Z is 6, and if you've seen previous videos, you probably know that AT is the names of attributes. So we know that if we check where they're set up here, if we count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we know that AT6 is going to be that, capital SIZ, which stands for size. So that will set up, so sorry, I clicked on the wrong one there. Go to roll versus attribute. So it'll say set x equals rolling against SIZ, rolled whatever you roll. Remember that plus, when we're dealing with strings, plus doesn't mean sort of add the values together. It just means add this text on to the end. So it's rolling against SIZ dash rolled 14 or whatever it may be. Then, if y is greater than AVZ, and again, if you've seen previous videos, you'll know that AV is the current score that the player has in a particular attribute. So this would be the player's or the player character's size score. If y is over their size score, we know that this by itself just means print that string, and then space dash space failure, and we set Z to 0. Else, in other words, if y isn't higher than the player's size score, still print X, but print success. I could have actually, because I'm printing X in both cases, I could have put that X up here like that, and then, or in fact, I could have done all that up there and then just had the failure and the success down there, but I thought it'd be a bit easier to read doing it twice. So if y is greater than the player character's current size, print that string and the word failure and full stop and set Z to 0. Otherwise, still print that string, but instead of failure, print success and set Z to 1. And then that's just telling us to end the paragraph and do a couple of line breaks. So you'll get some result like rolling against size, you rolled an 11, or it doesn't say you rolled an 11, rolling against size dash, rolled 11, and success. Let's say if your size was 12, that would be a success. Or rolling against size, rolled 20, failure. And then we'll have Z is 0 or Z is 1, depending on whether we've got a successful failure. And because we came here with an include rather than with a go to, and because it's sort of run out of things to do, let's come to the end of the page, it'll then go back to where it was. I just clicked the wrong one, sorry. It'll go back to where it was, which is there, and now we see what Z does. If Z is 0, in other words, if it was a failure, you're too short to keep your head above water and you soon drown, you lose. And if else, in other words, if Z is 1, you wade across the river and you make it. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because if we go back to role versus attribute, it's a failure if the random roll is higher than your score, which means that the higher your score, the more likely you are to succeed. And that makes sense in terms of the story of the game. If your size category is high, then you're presumably a sort of large character, and that means you're more likely to be able to wade across a river without it being too high for you. And if your size characteristic is small, then you're likely to be a small character, and therefore you're more likely that the river will be too high for you and you can't wade across it. So that's how that one works. Let's say we went via the bridge instead. So this we've seen before. This is just telling us print a particular picture, which I have saved in the folder with the game. There's a fierce monster guarding the bridge. This time we say set Z equals 1 and include roll versus attribute. So this time we'll be rolling against attribute number 1, which if we look at this list, we will see is STR or strength. So going back to bridge, we set Z to 1, roll versus attribute, set W equals Z. That just means, remember that we'll have a 1 for success or a 0 for failure. And so W will be 1 if we made our roll, or 0 if we didn't. And then we say set Z equals 1, again, include roll versus attribute, again, and set W equals W plus Z. So now Z will be 0 if we failed both our rolls, 1 if we succeeded in one and failed in the other, and 2 if we made both of them. You might go, well, why do we have to set Z equals 1 if we've already set it to 1? Well, it's because in this bit of code here, Z will be set to something else, because Z, like Y, X, and W, are temporary variables. They're used for lots of different things throughout the game. So we have this temporary variable W, which is 0, 1, or 2. If W is 2, then the monster senses that you've got this high strength. Presumably they can sort of see it by looking at you, and they cower from you and allow you to cross, and you win. If W equals 1, I won't go into this code. This is just the code which is to do with the creature asks you a riddle, and then you have to give it an answer. And then in any other circumstance, which is that W isn't 2 or 1, so it must be 0, because those are the only 3 things it can be, the beast picks you up and hurls you from the bridge, and you lose. And again, this sort of makes sense in terms of the story. If your character is strong, they probably look strong, and so if a monster is kind of sizing you up to see if they think they can take you on or not, well, the higher your strength is, the more likely it is that they'll think better of it and either cower from you, as it says, and just let you cross, or sort of ask you a riddle, which might not be a terribly rational thing to do, but that's the sort of thing that monsters do in stories of this type. And if you're very sort of weak looking, they might just simply pick you up and throw you to your death. So that's how we replace the way that we had it before, which was that what happens depends on what race you chose, just whether you're a human, elf, or dwarf. Now we can rely on attributes, and as I said in the previous video, the advantage of that is we can add new races without having to add any new coding in here. Because if I added, I don't know, lizard people or halflings or half demons or fallen angels or talking mice or whatever it may be, they're still going to have strength, they're still going to have a size score, and so we can roll versus that attribute and we can get results that, you know, make a certain amount of sense. If we had a sort of talking mouse option, presumably their size would be probably quite small, and therefore if they chose to wade across the river, they'd probably be too short to keep their head above water and soon drown. Similarly, I suspect a talking mouse wouldn't have terribly high strength, and so the monster would be likely to you'd be likely to end up in this situation where you don't pass either of your rolls and the creature hurls you to your death. You don't need to do any special new coding for the existence of mice or half giants or whatever you decide to add. It makes it more expandable. All we need to do is go into the bit where we've initialized the difference between the different races, which is basically this, and we also need a picture for them, and we need a picture, and then we need a shrunk version of the picture, and we also need to change this variable which tells the computer how many options there are for race. We would need to increase that if we're adding a new race. So it makes the game more expandable with less work in the long run. There are some problems with this setup, with this particular encounter, and I will look into some of those problems in my next video and hopefully offer some possible solutions. But for now, I hope that was useful and or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope that you will tune in next